This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about the social, legal, and economic forces that come to bear on our favorite beverage with Tyler Colman, better known as the wine blogger Dr. Vino, also the author of a new book, Wine Politics: How Governments, Environmentalists, Mobsters, and Critics Influence the Wines We Drink. Tyler Colman is a wine educator and a wine blogger, one of the best regarded in the wine blogosphere, where he's known as Dr. Vino. His new book, Wine Politics, examines how governments, environmentalists, mobsters, and critics influence the wines we drink, which is also, in fact, the subtitle. Tyler, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
So what I've heard is that this is an extension, or it's built upon work you did for your PhD dissertation. Is that true?
That is correct, yes.
And what was the actual official academic-sounding subject of that dissertation?
Well, I did my dissertation in the political science department at Northwestern University, so it's probably the first, definitely the first and probably the last dissertation on wine ever written in that department. But I did a certain subfield of political science called political economy, and that looks at economic questions, in my case, across different countries. The industrial sector is a common lens of analysis in political economy, and fortunately for me, all these big and serious industries like automobiles and machine tools and semiconductors had all been thoroughly analyzed. So I proposed a study on the political economy of the wine industry to my committee, and when they got over their belly laugh, they said, there might be something out there. Why don't you go out and research it and report back to us? And that's what I did, and that research served as the basis for this book, which I rewrote extensively to make it more readable by a broad audience, a non-political science audience. So I took out all the theory and a lot of the footnotes and things, and wove in more people and narrative, and even a little bit of conflict resolution.
Was wine already a pre-existing interest for you when you got into grad school, or was that just the area that no one else had done anything on, and that brought you to wine?
Well, a bit of both, actually. By the time I got to Northwestern, I had lived for about a year and a half in France and a year in Spain, and so those are great wine-producing countries, and so I had got to enjoy the fruits of the vine there locally. But then, yes, as you point out, there was this. Nobody had really researched wine from this perspective before. When I got there. So it was an original contribution to turn the frameworks of political economy on the wine industry.
And you mentioned how there wasn't much talk academically about wine, and today, even in popular media, in newspapers, you flip it open, you'll see stuff about the wine industry, about the politics and the economics of wine. Was there just not any of that in general, not that kind of discourse in the time you were doing that dissertation?
Not so much. I mean, I think you have seen more of an interest in various components of the wine industry, not just how wine tastes in the glass, but the story of the industry side. And so there was a book that has done very well recently that described the history of the Mondavi family, and that was very much a business history. And so I think that you are starting to see more of that in writing for a broad audience, and not maybe a little bit more in political science. Certainly, there's been more research in food too in political science since I started my dissertation.
You've put a wealth of examples of how the political process handles wine in Wine Politics, the book, but how might just your average American wine drinker in their wine buying, in their wine drinking, in their wine finding experiences, where could they look to find an example of something that politics has, for good or ill, done to their experience?
The two countries that I look at in the book are France and America, two great wine-producing countries. France, which has a longer history of making quality wine and exporting it. The United States, a more recent entry onto the world stage of quality wine. I'll give you an example from each country. For for American wine, it's actually really the main thing is whether the consumers have access to the wine. And so there may be a small startup wine producer in, say, California or Oregon or Washington or any one of the other 47 states, because wine is made in all 50 states now. And somebody out of state may want to get their hands on that wine, but that may not be legally an option because the winery may be prohibited from sending the wine directly to the consumer. So although we can order books and computers and iPods and things directly from the producers of those consumer goods, wine we cannot always order directly from the producer. And so it's a source of great consternation for wine enthusiasts not to be able to get the wines that they may want to try. So that's certainly one vivid example from the American side. From the French side, one example is how the wine tastes in the glass. And so for a producer, some producers now are trying to make wines very naturally, and those wines are being proven to be atypical in a tasting committee, a local tasting committee. And so some of those wines that are excellent, oftentimes superior to their peers, are being rejected by their peers from getting this stamp called the appellation, the AOC, as it's commonly known. And so those wines are having to be made outside of the appellation system now, with the sort of lowly administrative category of vin de table. So what does that mean to the consumer? Well, if they're still making them, then it might not be such a big deal because you're still able to find them regardless of what's written on the label. But the fact is that existing system actually does deter a lot of innovation, and it does deter some winemakers from perhaps making the best wines that they can.
Now let's go back to the American side first of things. And this is a subject I remember. You may know him, Bill Wilson, who did the Wine for Newbies podcast. He devoted an entire show to complaining about how, because he lives in Indiana, he runs into hassles trying to get wine shipped to him and not being able to do it, essentially. Why would that be the case? Is that just an effect of a middleman lobbying to get themselves locked into a position where they're in the middle of a bottleneck, or as it were, or what's the politics there?
Absolutely. And so if you look at the shape of the wine industry in the United States, you've got about 5,000 producers of wine now in America, and that number is just going up by the hundreds every year. Wine is incredibly popular in America, and people are pouring their hearts and souls and checking accounts into making wineries. And on the other hand, you've got tens of thousands of retailers. And so to get a wine from a winery to a retailer, it has to pass through a distributor when the wine is going out of state. There are some exceptions, like in California, for example, a producer can sell directly to a retailer. But once the wine goes out of state, then it must pass through a distributor. And so the distributor, they only number in the hundreds. And there's increased consolidation at the distributor level. So for Mr. Wilson in Indiana and many other wine enthusiasts, there are actually only 4 wine distributors in Indiana. And so in order to get a wine into the Indiana market, a producer, a wine marketer has to win a place in the portfolio of a local distributor. And there's if one rejects them, there's not a lot of other choices there. So in that regard, prices can be higher where there's less competition, and the selection can be smaller. It's a point of great frustration for wine enthusiasts in smaller markets in America.
So then the combined frustration of the wine enthusiasts in those markets and the producers who want to serve those markets better is still not enough to overcome the combined will to exist of the few distributors there then?
Well, the thing is that it's if you think about it from an economic logic, the logic of economics, the local distributors are very focused on maintaining their business, and so they are able to grease the wheels locally to maintain laws that maintain the status quo. But for a producer, their interests may be more dispersed because there's so many states. It's hard to fight 49 battles at the same time. goes to all the other states. And for a consumer, too, it's kind of low down on our political radar screen, too. There hasn't yet been a Cabernet uprising in the streets of Indianapolis.
So maybe we should get a little bit clearer on the structure of the wine production and delivery system as it has evolved in the U.S., because even a lot of wine drinkers don't seem to know. So when the producer produces the actual wine, where does it go next?
Then it goes to a distributor. It's sold to a distributor. Well, I should say, maybe I'll just back up 1 second and just say that California makes about 90% of American wine. So that's in particular why the out-of-state question is so important, because people in the other 49 states would like to enjoy that wine. And then also maybe I'll just add that the wine industry itself is fairly concentrated, and that the top 30 producers make about 90% of the wine as well. So there are a lot of small producers and a lot of enthusiasts in a lot of states who would love to try those wines. But what happens is that a producer, big or small, sells their wine from the winery one of two ways. One is the traditional way through a store, and to get to that store out of state, it has to go through a distributor. So the winery would have to sell it for about 30% of the retail price to a distributor, who then marks it up and then sells it to the store, who then marks it up. You can see right away that if say a wine's $10, if a winery is going to sell that for $3 to a wholesaler, who then sells it, who then marks it up and sells it to the store, who then marks it up and sells it for $10, that's much better economically for the winery to sell directly to the consumer at $10. And so wineries, particularly small wineries, thrive on these direct sales, whether they're through the winery tasting room or through the winery mailing list. And so actually the economics of a small winery really depends quite often on the success of these direct sales, just because the profit margin is so much greater for them.
Now, how does the structure that we've talked about compare, to move over to the French side of things, to the one that's in place in France? How different or similar do they look?
On the distribution side, it looks completely different, because unlike the disorganized but regulated and hard to navigate system in the United States, it's a total free market in Europe. And that was what was actually sort of a paradoxical finding of my research from a political economy standpoint, is because quite often Europe is held up as the more bureaucratic and the more regulated of the two examples of countries, the United States and say the EU. And so in this case, it was actually the EU that was less regulated and easier. So it's easier to ship a bottle of wine from Bordeaux to Berlin than it is from Napa to Nashville. It's that part of the logistics side, getting the wine to the consumer, is quite easy in Europe, despite the fact that you're going across country lines.
Now, that distinction there, where the French wine economy, at least the wine component of it, is more free market than the U.S. one. That's, of course, counterintuitive in itself. But you describe how, in the book, there are not so much state regulations, but there are a lot of regulations that are applied internally. They're put there by the wine producers themselves. What's going on there?
The wine producers do set their own norms and rules, and they have the power of law for the top wines, which are known as appellation wine in France. And so if you wanted to go and a nice suitcase full of money fell from the sky and you wanted to start a winery in California, you could do so with relative ease, and there wouldn't be too many restrictions, although I do get into some of the growing restrictions or the growing pressures of land use issues. That would be the main problem in California. But if you took your suitcase full of money and wanted to start a vineyard in France, it would be much more difficult, actually. If you were trying to plant it from scratch on new soil, then it's very difficult to plant a new vineyard, because those are actually planting. You have to buy what's called planting rights. And those planting rights are parceled out in a zero-sum fashion. So for you to plant 1 acre of vines, you'd actually have to buy the rights from somebody who was uprooting an acre of vines. And so that's aimed at reducing and controlling the overall number of vineyard acres in Europe. So what a lot of people do when they find this suitcase of money and they want to get into the wine business in France is that they buy a pre-existing property presumably a quality property. But even that land is becoming extremely expensive. In Burgundy, for example, even producers, small family producers who have been making wine there for generations, are getting priced out now of Burgundy. So it is getting increasingly expensive. But once you did have that vineyard, you'd have to abide by the laws and the rules of the appellation, and so they govern all kinds of things, including the types of grape varieties planted, and the vine density, the whether or not you can irrigate, and then also the yield. And so there's an effort to keep the yield down in quality areas, because unlike wheat, where you want to let the yield rip, in grapes with making wine grapes, you actually want to have a lower yield, because that makes higher quality wine in the end. So there are a lot of regulations on the production side in France, whereas in the United States it is freer. You do have a freer hand. So that does sort of conform to our pre-existing notions of the two countries.
It may be grotesquely reductive for me to say this, but I wonder, how much of the situation or the problems of the new winemaker in France can be explained by saying that the existing winemakers are a club and they don't want you in?
Yeah, it is very clubby, that's for sure. And these natural wine producers in France are the ones who are really being hit hardest by this club aspect, because in a lot of cases, in Beaujolais, for example, which has been a region that has been very hard hit, and the Loire, where there are lots of grape varieties, and there are some producers who are reviving these sort of heirloom grape varieties. They want to do things a bit differently than the norms, than the club, the appellation, would allow. And their wines are actually not being awarded the AOC certificate, because in the tasting committee, in the blind tasting by committee of local producers, their wines are deemed atypical. And so they're incredibly tasty and very interesting and worthwhile, but they're not typical anymore, because the what is typical has become something else in a way, and perhaps more manipulated in the case of Beaujolais. For example, there's a small producer, Jean-Paul Brun, whose wines were just not allowed to have the appellation of Beaujolais, because he doesn't use commercial yeasts. The norm is to bring in the grapes to the crush pad, where the natural yeasts are inoculated and a commercial yeast is introduced. But he doesn't do that. He actually just lets the grapes ferment into wine using their indigenous, their natural yeasts. And so the resulting wines are very tasty and very distinctive, because they're not manipulated. That's just one example of how the winemaking can be changed, and how some producers in France are trying not to conform to the rules, and they're paying a price because his wine, as I said, was not allowed to have the appellation.
What becomes of these wines, then, that go for the desired AOC, and they're complex and they're good, but they are not deemed typical, and they don't get the AOC? What do they do after that?
Well, then it's the question, it's up to the producer and their various importers in various countries of what they want to do with it. And in the United States, it may not be such a concern to the consumer, whether it's appellation or vin de table, the lowest category. But in France, that matters tremendously, and that's why the producers cling to it. So what happens then with a lot of those wines is that they are exported to markets that don't cling to this appellation hierarchy, the vin de table, with the vin de table being the lowest category. And so I was talking with a producer from Burgundy, and one of his wines was not allowed the appellation. He's a very natural wine producer, and so he said that he exported it all, in his case, to Japan, because he has a huge following in Japan. So that's what happened. But he said that it did cost him, though, about 30,000 euros, because he did have to make changes and mark it down a little bit.
I love how even in the world of wine, if you can't get a big following somewhere else, you can still get a huge following in Japan.
In Japan, yeah.
That's great. Speaking of Japan, of course, is not France. It is not the U.S. Are other wine-producing countries that aren't France and the U.S., are they more free as a rule? Do they not have the political problems?
Well, there is a split between the old world and the new world in wine. And the old world generally is Europe, that implies Europe. And so all the European countries, all of European agriculture has been Europeanized. Wine, it started originally with wheat and dairy products in the late 1950s, and wine fell under the European Common Market Organization a bit later, at the end of the 60s. But by now, everything falls under the general guidelines of the EU. For quality wines at the top of the quality hierarchy, what they do is they devolve the authority to the member states, the countries, to set their own regulations. But generally, everything has to conform to EU regulations. So yes, so in the EU, it's going to be harder to. There are going to be more regulations on the production side, but as I said, in the distribution, once you made it, you can sell it pretty easily. But then in the so-called New World, which includes winemaking areas in North America and South America, South Africa, Australasia, principally, generally the world ex-Europe. And so you tend to have a much freer hand there to do what you want and select which grape varieties. If you wanted to go and plant a vineyard of Gewürztraminer in Napa Valley, you could absolutely do that.
In the book, you touch on New Zealand, and you touch on more so on Australia, more than touch on Australia. And that's a country that in, especially, say, the Anglophone parts of Europe, it will be regarded as kind of a free frontier mentality where anything goes. It seems to be relatively like that in their wine industry as well. What's the difference for an Australian wine consumer with all this freedom that the producers and distributors have? How is it different for someone who's actually just drinking wine in Australia?
First of all, I'd just like to say that they do have freedom insofar as they don't have a lot of the appellation regulations, but that there has been a subsidy. There was a subsidy for about 2 decades in Australia to plant vines, and so you saw the vineyard area in Australia expanding quite rapidly, and that actually has led to a glut situation now. And so for a couple of years, there was the prices were quite soft. Now Mother Nature has intervened in this typical boom-bust fashion that plagues the wine industry. And now there's a drought in Australia, so there's a bit of scarcity now. But it was government policy that did lead to this glut, this overplanting. But as far as being a consumer, how would you taste it? Well, for example, you wouldn't be buying a wine based solely on the place name, because New World consumers tend to buy the wine based on the grape variety. And so it was a conundrum for producers in the New World, about what to call their wines, because they may have been making a Cabernet Sauvignon in the style of a left bank Bordeaux, for example, but they couldn't call it Bordeaux. And so the question arose, well, what are we going to call it? Well, we'll call it by the grape variety. And so that is a classic sort of difference between the Old World and the New World, is that most of the New World wines tend to be varietally labeled, whereas Old World wines tend to favor the place that the grape came from. Now, the follow-up on that is that you're starting to see both reciprocating in a way and respecting the other's way of doing things now. And so for this administrative category called the Vin de Pays in France, you're starting to see a lot more varietal labeling coming out of there, and they're trying to be more competitive against New World imports and New World wines in the global marketplace. And so it's been actually a huge challenge for the French wine industry to be more competitive at, say, wines under $15. So they are adopting more of this varietal labeling now. And by the same token, in the Old World, you're starting to see more of a recognition of place as more generations of winemakers gain experience in countries around the New World. You're starting to see more of a regional specificity emerging. It's not a regulated one. It's not regulated as strictly, I should say, as in the Old World, because although we have what are called AVAs, American Viticultural Areas in the United States, and there's sub-AVAs too, so there is a greater amount of specificity, but they don't have any of the rules that apply in Europe regarding, for example, grape varieties and irrigation and vine density and so on.
In the Australia section of the book, you spend a little bit of time talking about a wine that anybody who goes to art galleries with any regularity will have already drank about 10,000 gallons of at this point. It's Yellowtail that I'm talking about. It seems like it's a new breed of wine that has only come along in the last 10, 15 years. What does Yellowtail and what do wines like it mean in the wine world? What's their significance?
It's been a fantastically successful brand from a commercial standpoint. It was introduced in 2001 with 250,000 cases, which is already quite a large wine label. But it was so popular that it leapt like the wallaby on its label up to the 10 million case label last year. 10 million cases a year. So that's a huge wine brand and a successful launch, as I say, from a commercial standpoint. From a wine enthusiast standpoint, not quite as much of a success. The wines are produced in such enormous quantity that they really lack a lot of that specificity that wine enthusiasts crave. There's not a lot of vintage variation, and because the designation on the label is so large, just southeast Australia, which is a vast vineyard area, then there isn't a lot of specificity, and wine enthusiasts love to taste the site, the vineyard site, where the grapes were grown, whether it's on the north side of the river or the south side. It can make a difference, and so there's none of that intrigue with Yellowtail.
There's a phrase you use on the blog and in the book. It's something, I don't know if you use it directly, but you do refer to this phrase. The idea of brand means bland. How much of a law actually is that in wine? How much does brand really predict blandness?
It's difficult to say. Obviously, brand at the lower end of the quality spectrum most often does mean bland, unfortunately, because again, brand is driving for consistency from vintage to vintage, and that is not what wine geeks really delight in. It's more akin to a mentality from soft drinks, for example, or other consumer goods. But part of the enjoying wine is, and some of the frustration too, is the chase and trying to find a great bottle from a great producer from a great year. But yeah, there are. That said, at the high end, there are certainly some brands. And they may not be bland. These brands are global brands. They are made in California and Bordeaux and Champagne and beyond. So it's not so easy to say that they're always bland, just because there are some larger scale Bordeaux wines in particular that are quite tasty. A lot of the top wines from Bordeaux, so-called first growths, are made in 20,000 cases a year production, and so that's actually pretty high volume, and also high priced. When you're talking $500 a bottle, that's a nice amount of revenue. But yeah, a lot of the brands in the New World are part of bigger corporations, and they do have deep pockets, these corporations, and so they could do something pretty interesting. And sometimes they do. Unfortunately, most of the time they don't.
Since you no doubt have a lot of experience interacting with people who are just starting with wine, just getting into wine, I wanted to ask you something you'll be fairly well placed to respond to, I think. And with these wines, these sort of Yellowtail style wines, I'll call them, where it's super high volume and it's quite low price, are these, in your mind, from what you've seen, more of an intro to wine, a gateway drug for people, or are they just, for the massive audiences they've developed, is that the wine they're going to be drinking from now until whenever? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. No, I do think that it is an entry wine in a lot of ways, a gateway wine, because like $2 Chuck from a few years ago was a big wine, domestic wine sold through Trader Joe's grocery stores for $2. Yellowtail is $7 or something like that. So these are lower priced wines, and a lot of people find them very accessible in terms of price and in terms of labeling, and so reach for those wines. They aren't especially challenging, as I say, or I would say rewarding, really, from a wine enthusiast perspective, and so I do think that people, once they get into the habit of reaching for wine, that then when you try other stuff, it can open a lot of doors to greater wine excitement. I do think that it's a good thing insofar as it gets people to try wine and opt for wine over some other choices. But I do think that if you try some other stuff, that it sort of sets you up better for understanding other types of wine in the future. Yeah.
Tell me if my following perception is correct. With the way the wine world has changed, as you've described in wine politics, 20 years ago, if you wanted to buy a $3 bottle of wine, if you could even find one, you would be buying just foul Skid Row Dreck. But today, you're only going to be buying something that, from a wine geek's perspective, is just really, really, really boring then?
Right. Right, exactly. It tastes a bit more like soda in a way because there is this emphasis on consistency, and there's also emphasis on sweetness too. And so a lot of lower-priced red wines have a high amount of residual sugar in them. And so it's funny because I pour champagne in a lot of my classes and events and things, and sometimes people say, well, it's a little bit sweet, but the maximum amount of champagne sugar that a champagne, residual sugar that a champagne can have in it is 15 grams to be called brut. But a lot of these sweet red wines are actually at about 30 or 40 grams of residual sugar. So they're quite a bit sweeter than champagnes that people say, oh, I don't like that, it's too sweet. But then they gulp down red wines that are actually very high in sugar. And so that actually, to me, high alcohol and high sugar are actually some issues today in the world of wine making, some stylistic choices that winemakers make, and a lot of winemakers in the New World do grapple with hotter, warmer growing conditions, and so high alcohol levels is something that we're seeing a lot more of. But the sugar, the residual sugar, certainly doesn't have to be there, and it can be fermented out. But it's something that some winemakers leave in because it, especially at the low end, because it does make the wine more immediately user-friendly.
If you're just tuning in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas from Colin Marshall Radio at colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Tyler Colman, better known as the wine blogger Dr. Vino. He's the author of Wine Politics, How Governments, Environmentalists, Mobsters, and Critics Influence the Wines We Drink. Since you've talked to winemakers about this, I should ask you this as well. One of the sort of half-baked theories I'd thrown around in my mind was that the way you described those certain sweeter than they have to be wines taste, I always thought that was a way to get people who don't normally drink wine to drink wine by making the wine a little bit closer to the beverages they were already drinking. Let's say they were drinking soda, because I found that I never really drank soda, and so I never latched on to sweet wines. I was more of a tea drinker, so I was all over the place in other parts of the wine sector. But is that the strategy, like to make it like other beverages?
I don't have a smoking gun or anything I can point to for you. But I would imagine that's a lot of the strategy. And also, high alcohol wines tend to taste a little bit sweeter too. The palate perceives alcohol when it gets to a higher level as a sweet note, and so that may contribute to it too. Since you're a tea drinker, you might have preferred more tannic wines, perhaps, or more bitter wines, maybe red wines from Italy, for example.
And a tea drinker that leaves the tea bag in for 5 hours. So yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because that's what tannins are. They taste like. Sometimes people ask me, "What are tannins?" And I say, well, it's like leaving 20 tea bags in a cup for a half an hour, and then you go back and you taste it, and then that is very tannic. So yeah, the tannins are fun. Tannins are make a wine age worthy to a large extent, and so yeah, they are fun. They can be a little bit too aggressive in their use in some areas. Although, again, there's been an effort now to reduce the tannic bite of younger wines to make them more appealing in their youth. And so there's certain winemaking techniques winemakers can employ to do that. For example, micro-oxygenation, which is you have a big tank of fermenting red wine, and so there's a line at the bottom of the tank, and the winemaker can run these small, tiny bubbles through the tank, and so those bubbles are bringing oxygen in contact with the wine, and so that actually, in a way, it speeds up the aging of the wine and makes it softer, makes those tannins softer early on, and so that's something that you're seeing now quite a bit is that. Softening of the tannins to make red wines more approachable in their use, but also you've got to wonder if you're robbing Peter to pay Paul in a certain way, and And now wines, a lot of red wines, particularly from the New World, might not be able to last quite as long as they used to.
You cover, besides politics, you also cover the effect of critical opinion on wine. And if we're talking about critical opinions on wine, you really can't avoid mentioning Robert Parker, and you certainly don't shy away from mentioning him in the book. And whenever I talk about Robert Parker, there's inevitably going to be a sector of people who will chime in and say how much they hate Robert Parker. Why so much hate?
Why so much hate? A good question. He has been phenomenally successful. For those of your listeners who don't know, he is a very influential critic, and he can really make or break a winery and their wines with his review. But part of the backlash against Robert Parker is his use of scores. So he writes a tasting note, usually full of lots of full-throttle prose, and then tacks on a score allegedly out of 100, but more realistically between 90 and 100. And so a lot of the backlash is against this sort of reductionist nature of trying to define a beverage through its by putting a score on that. And we don't score a lot of other aspects of our artistic life. We don't score art and score books, for example. But Robert Parker barrels in and gives it a score, and that's to the extent that he is using that as a shorthand for his own opinion for himself, that's great. But the thing is that he has so many subscribers to his newsletter, and his scores then get taken and ripped away from the prose, and so much wine is just sold based on the score. And so that's where the score becomes disembodied, and it's taken as fact more than opinion. And at the end of the day, it's just a guy in Moncton, Maryland, who is writing what he likes about wine. But people seem to forget that it is subjective, and then they start to think that one wine is necessarily better than another wine. So yeah, it raises all kinds of questions then, and particularly because he likes a certain style, oftentimes likes a certain style of wine, and he tastes the wine devoid of context, and so he is tasting wines blind quite often, but sometimes not. But he's tasting them in an office setting, away from food, and so most consumers actually will not taste in the morning and not taste 100 wines at a time, and will have them with food. And so, in a way, his experience is a little bit atypical, and perhaps as a result of that experience, his methodology, he tends to like wines that are bigger and bolder in the red category, certainly, but also in the whites. And so that's sort of a large part of the backlash against him, is that subjectivity is taken as fact, and also his stylistic preferences. He has distinct stylistic preferences. And now there's even some firms that cater to him. I mean, it's been a long... it's well known that if you're a winemaker, or a winery owner rather, a vintner as they're called, and you want to have your wine do well, you can hire a certain from a handful of wine consultants who charge high fees, and they seem to have the magic touch in terms of getting a high score from Robert Parker. But now, taking that step even going even one step farther with that, there's this company in California now called Enologics, which is a winemaking consulting company, and they will actually promise to make you a wine that gets a certain Parker score within plus or minus 1 or 2 points. So it's winemaking taken a long way from simply an expression of the vineyard or an expression of the grape when you're trying to make the wine for one particular consumer.
Here's the core of the Robert Parker controversy that I find the most fascinating. It's one that not a lot of people seem to talk about, but as we just described, Robert Parker gives out scores in a context he's working in. He's giving out scores for how good a wine is when you're tasting 100 wines a day in your office while not eating anything. But why is he still so trusted by a consumer who is going to be drinking the wines while eating food, who is going to not be drinking 100 wines a day? Why is he still so trusted if he's so far away from common experience?
He is trusted, but that said, he is trusted because he's been right. I think that's just the simplest way to say it, and that he has convinced legions of consumers that the types of wines that he likes are very good wines, and a lot of people have agreed with him. And so that's the sort of the short version of the story. But how does he continue to do it? Well, the thing is, he also is slowing down a bit now, and he's expanded his staff. So now he's farmed out most regions of the world to other people. And so the wine areas that he covers now are actually shrinking to just Bordeaux and California, basically, and the Rhone. And so his influence is dwindling even within his own publication, you could say, as these other critics rise to take these other assignments. And even outside of his own publication, you could say that his influence is dwindling, because there's a new wave of wine shops across the country that are not using Parker scores or scores from magazines, and they're writing up their own tasting notes now and putting those on the shelf, or they're encouraging consumers to actually talk about the wines instead of making their selection based on a flap of paper. And plus, there's more, as we gain more confidence about wine, consumers are able to make more of their own decisions and not rely on someone else's opinion. I mean, certainly you can hear what his or one of his critics' opinions is, but I think that it's a little bit more contested now, and you see that contested in bulletin boards, and you see that contested on blogs, and so I think that the Parker chapter in wine appreciation was an extremely important one. I mean, it's so incredibly important. It's several chapters, but I think that we're getting near the end of that section. We're certainly not at the end yet, but it'll be interesting to see 10 years from now what the shape of wine criticism looks like, because it'll no doubt be quite different.
To return to some of the aspects of politics and political activism that have affected wine over the years, environmentalism, how is that different in its effects on wine between the U.S. and the EU? Because environmentalism is quite different in those two places, different goals, different methods.
That is true, yeah. I bring up environmentalists in two ways in the book. One is to talk about the rise of natural winemaking, and so there's a lot of winemakers around the wine world who are embracing these more natural methods of wine. And I think that's a good thing. They quite often produce wines, as I said earlier, that are very distinctive and often extremely tasty. But yeah, another way that I look at environmentalists is in the role of local land use politics. And so in France, it's funny because environmentalism is never invoked, essentially, for maintaining vineyards. It's more about culture for maintaining vineyards, particularly when there is a threat of urban sprawl around, as there has been around the city of Bordeaux. But in the United States, environmentalism is often invoked for and against vineyard expansion. In California, particularly Napa Valley, where some of the conflicts have been the most high profile, the environmentalists have actually teamed up with new residents in Napa Valley to prevent a lot of further vineyard expansion. And so, paradoxically, it's very difficult to plant a new vineyard in Napa Valley, particularly if that vineyard is on a hillside. And so that is sort of a paradoxical finding, just because, again, we think that it's a free country and free market economy, and it's actually it's actually very difficult now because of these environmentalists to plant a new vineyard. And I tell the story of one producer in Napa Valley who tried to develop a vineyard and had to jump through all these hoops and get all kinds of approvals from the local authorities and the state authorities in order to plant the vineyard. And so it does raise the price of vineyard development quite a bit and slows it down, and in some cases stops it altogether.
With all the obstacles you've described in wine politics, I'm a little shocked, frankly, that anybody ever gets into the wine game anymore.
There's so much glamour.
Speaking of getting into games, you are now, by most objective measures, one of the most read wine bloggers in the wine blogosphere. What did the world of online wine writing of any kind, let alone blogging, look like when you started Dr. Vino?
Well, the web was increasingly important. I mean, I started it because at my PhD dissertation defense party, some of my friends bought me the URL Dr. Vino, and I said, "Wow, great! Now what do I do with that?" And so then I actually felt like I had to start a website, so I did that for a while as a quote-unquote website. But then with the 2004 presidential election, we certainly saw the power of blogs in the national level. And so I took note and switched over to some blogging software, and I've been writing a blog ever since. And so it's fun. It's something I update every day. And we have great discussions. It's fun to see the exchanges, and I think that's just what makes wine exciting today, is talking about wine, and as well as, of course, drinking it, but you can't do that on the Internet, so we talk about it instead, and I think it's fun. I think it's really a fun space and an important space. It's very fast-moving and very much very interactive, so it's a fun place to be.
What does wine blogging give you that other aspects of your wine life not give you? I mean, you can go and talk to wine enthusiasts at parties. What does blogging do that nothing else can for you?
Blogging is very cheap and very fast. It's my costs are $6.95 a month for my website. And it's instantaneous and has a worldwide reach. It's great in that regard for opening up a discussion, because from my home or even in my classes, I can only reach so many people, but the power of the Internet is that you can reach everybody, and so that's just really exciting.
I wanted to make sure to ask you about the wine classes you teach at NYU and the University of Chicago. What sort of students do you get at these classes? Is there even a type, or is it just you never know who's going to come in the door?
Those are in the schools of continuing and professional studies at each university, and so they tend to vary a little bit, but in terms of demographics. But with the NYU classes skewing a little bit younger, but yet generally they are people who are thirsty for wine knowledge, and that's increasingly the case in the United States today. I mean, we're in a bull market for wine consumption in America right now. We have 15 consecutive years of per capita growth in consumption, and along with that desire to drink more wine, people want to learn more about it too. And so there's a lot of opportunities for wine events and classes, and to learn about wine and talk about wine. So, and I encourage people to absolutely look for classes near them, and also tastings at wine shops are also a good way to learn. In a lot of states, those are free, and so definitely take advantage of that. Why not try some wines on somebody else's tab?
When you're putting together a wine curriculum, what in your mind is the sort of knowledge, or are the items of knowledge, that wine drinkers really need to know that they aren't getting? Or if I can phrase this another way, what do wine drinkers too often not know that keeps them relegated to a suboptimal wine experience when they decide they want to start drinking wine? What do you really think you've got to impress on them before they're going to have as good a time as you're having?
Well, there's so much intimidation factor in wine because, I mean, unlike movies, for example, American consumers have a lot of confidence in selecting their own movies, but we have a lot more cues, too, because we know a certain director or a certain actor and they have a track record and we like this movie or not. And also the total population of movies released every year is relatively small. I mean, it may seem overwhelming when you're standing at the video store or looking at Netflix or something, but only a couple hundred movies a year. But for the wine industry, there's probably 25,000 or more wines a year that we could choose from. So it can be incredibly overwhelming, and there's obviously the foreign language factor and lots of intimidation on the labels quite often. And so what I try to talk to people about is to show them what certain key things that they can look for, whether that's a grape variety that they like or a region that they like, and so that they can get more confidence to make choices in stores and restaurants, of course. I love to pour wines that have something similar, whether that's the place or the grape variety, and then something different. Maybe something about the wine making method is different. And so I love to make those kind of comparisons for people to show the difference of oak, for example, or of New World or Old World. And so when you can taste those side by side in two glasses, I really think that helps to drive home the point and help lead people to have more precise preferences and be able to articulate those.
Since we mentioned earlier the concept of the gateway wine, I should ask very quickly, do you believe in the concept of a gateway wine, or do you think any wine drinker, no matter what point in their wine drinking lives they're at, can drink any wine, or should drink any wine?
No, I do think that there are some wines that are more approachable than others, and as we were discussing earlier, the sweeter red wines generally would be more approachable, But I love, for example, Chinon, a red wine from the Loire that has a higher degree of acidity and maybe higher tannins, but I find that to be just incredibly interesting wine from the right producer, obviously. But I think that a lot of people might not want to cut their teeth on a Chinon. I mean, you're not going to have a 10 million case brand emerge out of Chinon.
Now, we're very nearly out of time, so I want to ask you one more thing. And that's about the new book you've got on the way. You're following up wine politics very closely with a book called A Year of Wine, coming out in November, I believe, the 11th. Can you give us a little teaser for that book?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a book that I sold to Simon & Schuster based on my blog. And so it's where I tell the story of wine in France and America in wine politics. With A Year of Wine, I tell people which wine to have at dinner tonight. So it's more of a practical guide, and what I do there is I encourage people to get out of their Chardonnay and Cabernet rut and to plot a seasonal arc to their wine consumption and to vary their wines, the wine in the glass, as the food on their plates change with the seasons. And so, it's a fun book. I really had a fun time writing it, and I'm really looking forward to it being available.
The book you can buy now, once again, is Wine Politics, How Governments, Environmentalists, Mobsters, and Critics Influence the Wines We Drink. Tyler Colman, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Well, thank you so much for the interest.
Visit Tyler Colman's wine blog, Dr. Vino, at drvino.com. Our music is produced by Ben Althouse. Hear more of his stuff at benalthouse.com. Find out more about the marketplace of ideas or visit our online show archive at colinmarshallradio.com.